So welcome everybody on this VE Day anniversary, or a little bit before. We're recording this about a week before our American Soldier Festival on the anniversary of VE Day, to help celebrate the success of the American Soldier Project on Zooniverse and talk a little bit about where it might be going. And specifically in this conversation, talk a little bit about the broader landscape of crowdsourcing projects in general, especially in the humanities and history. So let me introduce everybody here. I'll start with me. My name is Amanda French. I'm on the advisory board for the American Soldier Project. I first met Ed and learned about the project when I worked at Virginia Tech in the libraries there in charge of digital scholarship. And I since have left Virginia Tech, but have remained involved with the project and have been very glad to do so. Sam, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure thing. I am Sam Blickhan, and I am the Humanities Research Lead for the Zooniverse platform. So I do a lot of work with research teams who want to build projects, and then I also lead development efforts among our internal Zooniverse team for building new tools to help support research teams as well.
Fantastic. Sam, how did you get involved specifically with the American Soldier Project?
I got involved just sort of answering some questions. I think Ed reached out before you launched the project, and we sort of had a back and forth just thinking about how they were going to set the project up and thinking about the type of data they wanted to get out of the project and just some best practices about running crowdsourcing projects in general. And then we also hosted a workshop for the American Historical Association in January of 2017, maybe 2018.
18 or 19 was two age days ago.
2 years ago.
A couple of years anyway.
Yes.
Yeah. So that was a big piece of the sort of early collaboration. It was nice to have a sort of focal point in terms of, I think it really helps to focus your own building efforts if you're thinking about how you would communicate that practice externally to other people. So I really appreciated that part of our early collaboration for this project.
Fantastic. Kurt, why don't you go next, introduce yourself, and tell everybody how you got involved with the American Soldier Project.
Sure thing. So I'm Kurt Luther. I'm an assistant professor at Virginia Tech in computer science, and also an affiliation with the history department. And my research focuses on crowdsourcing and human-computer interaction. And I've just always been fascinated by ways that we can kind of combine the complementary strengths of crowdsourced human intelligence and artificial intelligence. I was really excited at the prospect of getting involved with the American Soldier Project. The way I came about it was I had been working with historian Paul Quigley on a crowdsourced transcription project for the American Civil War era. We built a tool called Insight that helped crowd workers not just transcribe the data, but also try to analyze and make sense of the documents that they were finding. And we realized this tool could be used for some other types of digital history projects. I got in touch with Ed Gitre. I think Ed actually got in touch with me. He had come across an amazing trove of the original American Soldier primary source documents and was looking for a way to get them transcribed. We saw this opportunity to use the early prototype that we had built for the previous project on this, and we had a lot of success. Ed had the students in his class use it successfully, and we realized we wanted to build this into something even bigger. So we identified Zooniverse as an awesome platform with a kind of community and scale that we were looking for to transcribe over 60,000 documents. And so I became sort of the crowdsourcing consultant on this effort as we expanded it to where it is now.
Hey, and Ed, you probably have introduced yourself. You probably need no introduction, but nevertheless, I'd love to hear about,
Yeah.
you know, your official title and
Yeah.
how you first got started with the American Soldier Project, which is your project.
Sure, happy to. My name is Ed Gitre, and I'm an assistant professor of history. And I have a couple of affiliations, one with the Center for Human-Computer Interaction. So yes, I'm the project director for the American Soldier, and I came across this amazing collection of documents back in 2009, so over a decade ago. And as I've written about, when I first came across these records, they were on microfilm, and the really just nondescript catalog entry let me know something about the records, but it wasn't until I started to look through the documents that I saw how amazing that they were. But they were in microfilm, and there was only one copy, the original copy, in existence, and so you'd have to go to Maryland to College Park to read them. And I knew at the time that they needed to be out there in the public. But I knew from the very beginning that this was a massive trove, because just looking at one of four, there were 44 microfilm reels, there was like 1,500 documents. So very quickly did the math. I was like, there's like at least 60, 70,000 pages here. So fast forward, I get to arrive at Virginia Tech in 2014, and it was like the perfect moment for me to come to Virginia Tech, because Paul, I can't remember when you and Paul Quigley started to hatch your project, but it just quickly inspired me to think about these sources that I found back in 2019. And I saw an opportunity. I thought, hey, I know you guys are building this project. I want to learn, because when I came here in 2014, I did not come with the background in the digital humanities. I went to the University of Michigan, and there I started off in engineering, so I had an appreciation. I had built websites. But when I got here, I saw an opportunity to learn. And so actually in the very beginning, even before I started to partner with Paul and with Kurt, I partnered with another historian at Florida State University, Kurt Peeler, who's one of our advisory board members. And I had my students in my World War II class courses transcribe documents in Omeka and Scripto in his collection. So it was an institutional collaboration from the very beginning. And that's how I learned. I was like, I'm happy to do this labor, to have my students do this on your behalf so that we can learn. And I just saw the benefits immediately for my students doing this work. And it just became really natural for me to think of the digital humanities, my teaching in the classroom, really closely intertwined and mutual benefits. So fast forward, we got a startup grant from the NEH, and Kurt was on that. And again, we wanted to scale up, because we knew we had so many documents, and it was great in the classroom to use Omeka and Insight, but there were scaling questions. And I remember the first time I went to Zooniverse, I saw in the history section, Humanities, that there were other war-themed projects. And I thought to myself, there's already a community here. We've got scale, and it just was really a natural fit. It was really fluid for us to transition from Omeka to Zooniverse, and things just took off. We launched the project in May 2 years ago, and we've just been overwhelmed by the involvement of our community members and how engaged they've been. And by the time you're watching this video, we will have completed the entire project. The transcription portion, annotation, which is about, I think, 200,000 individual entries, because everything is transcribed and annotated 3 times for quality control. So I could talk more, but that's it.
No, that's great. And I think we want to get in this conversation just at a sense of, like I said earlier, you know, what the larger landscape of crowdsourcing in general as a concept is, but then especially crowdsourcing in the humanities. And I think I'm going to go to Kurt and ask how you got involved with crowdsourcing generally to begin with, and maybe what are some of the other big crowdsourcing projects that you've been involved with?
Yeah, sure. I've been pretty excited about the internet and online communities as places for people to kind of come together and make things, especially with folks they may not come in contact with in the physical world for a pretty long time. I remember even before I came to Virginia Tech in college and graduate school, working with other folks through online communities on different kinds of collaborative projects. Like I was interested in making little movies and animated games and things like that, and didn't really know a lot of people in my immediate vicinity that were into this kind of thing, but was able to find the expertise and find the collaborators online. And I just always had found that to be really powerful and exciting concept. One of the first crowdsourcing communities that I really got actively involved with was Wikipedia, if you consider that to be a crowdsourcing site, which I think I do.
Yeah,
It's I remember the first couple of articles that I realized I could make improvements to. And at that point, it was just fixing little typos here and there. But then eventually I made my first little article, and for some reason it was about some obscure monkey species in West Africa. And I remember like probably read it in some random news article and realized there wasn't an article about it on Wikipedia, but I could make one. So I made this little article, and I got really excited about it, and then realizing that other people would benefit from that information. And eventually I ended up making a featured article, which is one that appears on the homepage of Wikipedia, and it's considered high quality, and it's an authoritative source in some way. That was about a building on the campus at my graduate school, Georgia Tech. So that was a highlight for me, in one of the first online communities and crowdsourcing projects that I spent a lot of time in.
wonderful. So now I definitely want to hear with Sam how you, I suppose, became employed by Zooniverse, and really any other memorable crowdsourcing projects you've been involved with there, perhaps especially, but not necessarily in the humanities.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly in terms of building projects, I've started with Zooniverse. It's been my home from the start. But actually, even I realized after I started my position that I volunteered on a Zooniverse project when I was doing my master's. I used to help volunteer on the Seafloor Explorers project, which was an early Zooniverse project looking at photos of the seafloor. And I used to do it because it was like the polar opposite of the sort of hardcore paleography, musicology stuff I was looking at, and like manuscripts from, the 14th century. And it was really relaxing and great. And I really loved, being part of a research project that was so wildly different from my own interests. And I mean, similarly to what Kurt was talking about, getting involved in sort of crowd-focused efforts, coming through digital humanities, I think we find that without necessarily intending to, just being in that online space and that collaborative space and sharing these resources, because I think so many of us come into that field in a sort of ad hoc way, which is really facilitated by these online communities and people who are so willing to share and talk and brainstorm together. But in terms of starting my job, I got started through a grant project that was funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences. Services? Gosh, I'll have to edit that one out maybe.
I think.
Institute of Museum and Library Services. Please don't tell my funders that I pronounced their name incorrectly. Yeah, and the first project that I worked on was part of that research project, and it was the anti-slavery manuscripts at the Boston Public Library project. And it's a custom project that we built while we were really looking at methods of transcription and wanting to do this sort of really specific methodological approach to transcription on the Zooniverse platform, because of the fact that it had so traditionally been a space for more sort of citizen science focused efforts, and all of the tools and the resources that had been generated in the, sort of 8 or 9 years that it had been running before I joined. And even, with the first couple of phases of early humanities projects on the platform, they were very much humanities projects functioning in that citizen science space. And so we really wanted to make a concerted effort to think about what are actually the inherent differences between these types of projects. Are there many? If so, how do we actually address them and make sure that that the tools and the platform that we're offering are actually supporting, dedicated humanities research projects, rather than trying to sort of MacGyver these humanities projects into a sort of science heavy space. But it's been a really interesting process to think about and to look at, because while yes, there are a lot of differences between these types of projects, there are also a lot more similarities than I think we may have necessarily assumed from the get-go. So it's really been a delight to be involved, and I'm very happy to be where I am. It's a great spot.
I'll say a little bit about this myself. I was involved in digital humanities very early on, just partly as a function of where I went to grad school, which was the University of Virginia, where in the 90s, mid 90s to late 90s, we were putting texts online, which back then was a kind of a big deal. And so I have been in the digital humanities for quite a long time. And what I remember was right around 2007, 2008, 2009, there began to be a lot of talk about crowdsourcing in various different realms. And where I was really starting to notice it was at places like the Library of Congress. And they were experimenting with places like Flickr, which is now, sort of an older site. But what they would do would be to digitize photographs from their collections, put them on Flickr, and then have the crowd of people who were using Flickr come in and tag those photographs with metadata so that they could be, better searched for and things like that. Describe them, comment on them. Eventually they would, have be able to make comments on the image itself. You could draw a little square around, somebody's face and so on. And some of those projects were extremely successful. People were able to identify unknown people in some of these archival and historic photographs. So I actually think it was probably Flickr and that kind of thing where I first got into the whole notion of, oh yes, if you open things up to the world, it's really amazing how many people will come and do something that you would think would be arcane. Because right around that period of time, there was a big conference in DC that somebody like Clay Shirky came to, where they were talking to libraries and museums about this. And at the time, libraries and museums in particular were not at all sure about putting their collections on the web. They were really worried that without expert intervention in analyzing and interpreting historic artifacts, people would get it wrong. They saw a lot of this, process of opening things up to the crowd as being a little dangerous because it would be unmediated by expert interpretation. And that always seemed a little wrong to me, and that there were also ways to manage that, to really have the experts in conversation with people, from around the world, untrained people, but sometimes extremely knowledgeable amateurs. And that's what you kept noticing, was that people would come out of the woodwork who knew far more than the quote unquote experts, especially if it was about, something that they had a great deal of specific domain knowledge in. So that was probably one of the first things. And then I wound up going to a lot of digital humanities conferences, unconferences, the Humanities and Technology Camp. And what I noticed was that in the humanities, the transcription projects in particular were some of the ones that were really, really best suited for a crowdsourcing approach. So I think in art history, they do some things. So there was this crowdsourcing approach of tagging and interacting with images. But, you know, because I come from an English department, we were working with handwritten manuscripts all the time. And you still can't slap them on a scanner and have that, you know, be something that's searchable by a search engine. So typing them in was something that we needed to do very early on. And we realized that this was actually, it's actually very fun. I find transcribing handwritten materials to be, just as you were talking about, Sam, very soothing. You know, it's very zen, you know, and sometimes the content is so fascinating. So I began to notice more and more platforms coming out that would do that. Omeka and Scripto, as Ed mentioned earlier, was an early one. From the Page is another transcription platform that I began hearing a lot about. And I then started to see projects from the New York Public Library. What's on the Menu was such a fantastic crowdsourced transcription project. So I've just, you know, I've seen more and more of these kinds of projects in the last, say, 10 to 15 years come out. But Ed's is, you know, as successful or more successful than a lot of them. So with that, I guess I'll take it back to Ed and say, you know, ask you sort of one of the burning questions, which is, what do you think the value of crowdsourcing is to the humanities in general and to history in particular?
Yeah, well, I think for me, it was incredibly formative. I mean, in some ways it was opportunistic for me to think that involving my students was one way of achieving this larger goal. But even from the beginning, I knew that I wanted my students to grapple with World War II and to read primary sources. So it was never peripheral, but I think that experience was so formative because they're learning in this process themselves. And what I saw is that when I opened it up to the public, it was a mirror image. It was, they, you know, there wasn't, it basically brought down the wall between the classroom and the public. So that was the first thing. And the second thing that came out of that experience and that integration was to see my students as producing history. And I think it's so easy to think of students as just consumers, and even in the public. So we build these projects, experts build these projects, and we think of people who come to them as consumers of what we've built. But for me, I've, you know, it's just completely upended that way of thinking about the public and the humanities, because I'm not coming at this from a particular kind of institution that's tasked with just preserving sources, but it was really about the sources from the very beginning and wanting them out in the public. So for me, it's just been so rewarding to think about the production of the humanities from a crowdsourcing perspective.
No, that's wonderful. I actually had heard some of my favorite people in digital history and digital humanities say, digital history is public history, you know, and you can argue about that all you want. And of course, public history is this very specific branch of history that takes to heart the notion of involving the public in history, maybe not as producers rather than consumers, but, you know, somebody like Ken Burns is producing public history when he's writing documentaries, and there is a branch of history, perhaps even the main trunk of history, that doesn't really necessarily involve the public in that way. So
yeah. For me, that's kind of a moot question. I see them so integrated, and I think there are public history projects that aren't digital, obviously, but I think the ethos really does cross over both categories. And I mean, what is the technology trying to achieve? It's, you know, in my projects, it's about making them accessible. Why would you want them to be accessible if it were not for people to have access? And who do you want to have access? Not just scholars, but you want to break down that wall between the scholar and the public, because ultimately, as scholars, you need to convince the public of your interpretation. You need to be able to validate by pointing to documents. And so for me as a historian, it's a full picture. And whether you fall into one category or another is secondary to the larger aims of the humanities and to my discipline.
Well, that's great. I think we're about out of time, but I'd like to invite both Sam and Kurt to say, is there any other final thing you'd like to say about the American Soldier Project or about transcription and the humanities in general?
I mean, just to sort of echo what Ed so eloquently said about, access in particular, I think Trevor Owens has a really lovely piece about this in Mia Ridge's book on crowdsourcing our cultural heritage, talking about how I think for practitioners in particular, crowdsourcing is often very task-based, and we have to think a lot about, like, okay, if we want to get this type of output, here's how we need to string these things together, and these very sort of specific data-driven decisions and questions, and thinking a lot about output. But I really appreciate the piece that Trevor wrote, because it reminds us that the experience is just as much of an important piece of output for these crowdsourcing projects as whatever data you get out the other side. And I really just appreciate how Ed and the team have brought volunteers into the fold in terms of highlighting really interesting discoveries or using social media, just making it a really welcoming space, not only in terms of accessibility, being able to see these really interesting pieces of history, but also accessibility in terms of feeling as if you're welcome to participate and that you actually have a voice and are contributing something meaningful. So, from my perspective, that's something that I really love about this project in particular.
Fantastic. Kurt?
Yeah, very well said. Just to build on what Ed and Sam have said already, coming at this project from a computer science perspective, a lot of computer science folks will just assume we would automate something like this, and, well, why don't we just automate the transcriptions and be done with it? What's the purpose of this crowdsourcing? But of course, that's not how it really works. It's not possible to do this with just technology, and instead it requires this marriage of humanity and technology to even make this historical research possible. One of the things that I love about crowdsourcing is it allows us to bring human intelligence and creativity into these very difficult challenges, like transcribing thousands of documents, and basically solve the problems that technology or computation or AI currently can't solve. So I think the American Soldier community is a great example of just how powerful that crowdsourced human intelligence can be for this kind of problem, and how we really do need lots of contributions from the public, and we've really benefited from that in this project to even make it possible in the first place. So I don't know how we could have done it without crowdsourcing, frankly.
Nope, no other way.
No other way. Yeah, this kind of project, I think, without these sort of crowdsourcing platforms and the many amazing volunteers who have put so much of their time and intelligence onto this project, I mean, this was somebody's life work, and they never would have been able to make these primary source documents available to the public without these tools and these methods. So extremely valuable work. All right, well, I think that's all we've got time for, but I can say I'm really, really looking forward to May 8th and seeing these other conversations on similar topics, and just in general celebrating the anniversary of VE Day and the birth of a new phase of the American Soldier.